Do you remember back in June of 2010, Toronto streets were on fire, literally. It was the G20 summit, and thousands were marching against globalization as part of a wave of worldwide protests. At the time, globalization seemed unstoppable. Transnational trade was booming, and economies were tightly linked. But 16 years later, that certainty is gone. Here's Nirdar Beda, CEO of Bridgewater Associates, an asset management firm at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month.
Turning around to what we call at Bridgewater modern mercantilism, which is instead of being focused on globalization and efficiency, being focused on self-sufficiency, national interest.
So, what does this shift mean for Canada and our economy? Welcome to The Rundown. Mercantilism might sound like something from a history lesson, but trade wars and tariffs could be pushing it toward a comeback. I sat down with Eric Helleiner, professor in the Department of Political Science and the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo, and Drew Fagan, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, to get insight into whether we're living through a modern revival and what that could mean for the global economy. Before we get into sort of a definition here, let's get an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about mercantilism. Mercantilism dominated European thinking on international economic policy in the 17th and 18th centuries. Mercantilist's underlying belief was that international economic policy is primarily a tool of state power. Since power, unlike prosperity, is relative, mercantilists think of international economic engagement as zero sum. You win, I lose. That was Martin Wolf in the Financial Times earlier this year. Eric, is this an accurate representation of mercantilism?
It is. I would add maybe two things. One is that mercantilists have a belief that power and wealth are deeply interconnected. So if you're trying to promote the power of your state, you're also trying to promote its wealth, and there's a reciprocal relationship there. And the other thing I would add is that you could be someone who believes in promoting the power and wealth of your state, but be a free trader. But in the case of mercantilists, the policy prescription that they have is not free trade. It's protectionist policies, but strategic protectionist policies. So these are not people who believe in autarky, self-sufficiency, but rather using protectionism in strategic ways to achieve objectives while your state remains in a relatively open world economy. And if I can just add one additional thing, it's not just at the border that they're interested in state activism or state interventionism, it's also within the economy. So subsidies and state-owned enterprises and all kinds of things like that.
When we think of mercantilism, I think a lot of people think about maximizing export, minimizing imports. You mentioned a few other traits there, but what about tariffs or colonization when we talk about mercantilism?
Yeah, so certainly historically, many mercantilists were imperialists as well, but it's not true of all of them. So there's a huge variety in the mercantilist camp. So, I mean, one way to think about the mercantilist camp is it's like an intellectual tradition, like economic liberalism. So Adam Smith has many followers. There's a similar line of thinkers in the mercantilist tradition, and some of them were imperialists, but others were anti-imperialists. So there's no consistency on that issue.
Drew? When we look around the world, we hear of countries making trade deals based on tariffs, becoming more self-reliant. In your view, is this a kind of global political economic shift happening right now?
There is a shift going on. And from the perspective of the Trump administration, the period of free trade, which really was part and parcel of the rules-based system after the Second World War, what became the World Trade Organization, was applying Adam Smith in the sense of trade raised all boats. And as Eric was saying, or you were saying, mercantilism is really zero sum. So you've got a whole series of countries around the world. As the World Trade Organization becomes less and less powerful, that are applying the principles of neo-mercantilism, if you like. You can see Donald Trump exports and imports and his concern about trade balances. This is a reflection of that. Also, subsidies, national champions, and governments thinking about their country for themselves. And that puts us, a classic free trader, at an even greater disadvantage up against the much bigger United States, considering that that's where the Trump administration appears to be going.
All right, before we get to Canada, I want to talk about the two biggest economies. We already talked about the US, but let's talk about China. Eric, China has been at the center of this neo-mercantilism idea. Can you give us some evidence to sort of support this? What have we seen?
Yeah, so China's an interesting case because it has a long tradition of mercantilist or neo-mercantilist thought. In fact, Chinese thinkers in the 19th century who were promoting this idea, would reach back into the 3rd century BC to the book of Lord Shang, who had ideas about power and wealth being interconnected. So this is a deep tradition in Chinese thought. Xi Jinping in the current leader of China, is very informed by mercantilist thought, figures like Sun Yat-sen from earlier in the 20th century. And the Chinese version of neo-mercantilism is a much more interventionist version than, say, the history of American neo-mercantilist thought, which also has deep roots in the 19th century. It's just in a less activist, less interventionist manner. It's also historically been much more export-oriented. That's a key feature of the kind of Chinese history of neo-mercantilism. So it's got its distinctive features, but certainly since Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, China has been pursuing neo-mercantilist policies.
Drew, we talked about the U.S. here. Trump's tariffs, shifts towards protectionism. Does this signal a full move to mercantilism? Is there a mix here when it comes to the U.S.?
We don't know, really. I mean, it's hard to predict how far he's going to go down this road. But as of now, he's certainly not pulling back. If anything, he's doubling down. If we think about the relationship with China, for example, the concern he has about the size of the Chinese trade balance, trade surplus, much of that in the form of consumer goods coming to the United States. There's been a long tradition that's changing now in which essentially everybody was a consumer and everybody benefited from low prices. And now we've got a situation in which, and Trump was ahead of this a decade ago, in which much stronger concern about the domestic economy, about workers, about things like manufacturing that have been stripped out to a sizable extent of the US economy. And the balance between being a consumer and being a worker for the economy-wide changes. And he continues to emphasize that. To some extent, the success depends on what sectors he's looking at helping. Right now, it's hard to see manufacturing really taking off in the United States, given the size of wages, or for something, coal, for example.
Let's talk Canada. Canada and China strike a deal for a reduction in tariffs on canola, seafood products, in exchange for a set number of EVs. Would this fall into a category of mercantilism? In part, and in part the special conditions which Canada has in relation to the United States, the government's desire to diversify trade, and what we're seeing in the last few days is the U.S. desire, and this is dangerous for Canada, to limit the ability of Canada to diversify trade. To begin with, 75% of our trade exports to the United States. China's more like 5%. So you got a challenge in terms of diversification. We've tried it many times and haven't been successful. What we may be seeing now is a new offensive, mercantilist, I guess you could say, in which the United States, as I was saying, tries to put pressure on Canada by limiting or choosing between the big U.S. market and other markets, in particular China. Eric, in your view, is Canada acting within a neo-mercantilist system?
I mean, in a general sense, anytime you're putting restrictions on imports, you can classify that as a neo-mercantilist policy if the goal is to maximize the power and wealth of your state. I think in the Canadian case, we have a long history of responding to the United States going against free trade. So we used to have a free trade deal in the mid-19th century that got abandoned, and we turned eventually to the national policy in the late 1870s, which was a neo-mercantilist strategy of trying to diversify trade, trying to build up a domestic market. And it's a response, though. It's a reactive response to the U.S. turning against free trade. We did the same in the Great Depression when the U.S. introduced the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. We turned very quickly to British markets, trying to find an alternative. When the Nixon shock happened in 1971, once again, we tried to diversify and we tried to build up national markets. So it's, in the Canadian case, it's generally been a reactive strategy in response to America itself turning away from free trade.
Help us understand a little bit what makes the trade deals of today different from the trade deals that were happening sort of under the banner of free trade.
So in the era, which you can call kind of the high point of free trade, 1990s, when the World Trade Organization is created, that's a multilateral set of trade negotiations where it's kind of one size fits all, and many of the countries of the world are involved in that process. What we're in right now is much more of a set of bilateral relationships, and I think the United States in particular would like a set of kind of bilateral hub and spoke relationships at which they are the center, and that maximizes their power. I think China wants the same thing. It's a kind of tributary model that they had historically, where China would make bilateral deals with states around the world and maximize its power through those bilateral relationships. So it's the difference between that kind of hub and spoke relationship and a more multilateral order in which all are governed by the same rules.
Drew, get you in?
Yeah, so the hub and spoke relationship is a good example in the North American economy, and the structure of NAFTA, which became CUSMA, the existing free trade agreement. In the early 1990s, the United States wanted to negotiate a free trade agreement only with Mexico. We insisted, and this is after the bilateral agreement, of being part of a trilateral agreement. Now the United States, one of the things they floated with regard to the continuation of the USMCA is dual bilateral, which would get at the same concern with regard to hub and spoke. It's part and parcel, I think, of U.S. putting greater pressure on Canada to serve them first, but in circumstances where they're not making it easy. They want us to serve them first, but in circumstances, because of their power, to take advantage, is simply put. I want to make a point. Eric was exactly right with Canadian history. We think of free trade as having been part and parcel of, the last 40 years and the reorientation towards the United States. There was less of a reorientation than this, in terms of the statistics. But the idea of a national policy, tariff wall, build manufacturing at home, for us, that was always a second choice. Right. The United States essentially offered us a binary choice. You can have free trade. This goes back to the 19th century if you become part of the country. If you don't want to become part of the country, you're not going to have free trade. I'm simplifying hugely, but there's a lot of truth to it. And that balance, especially, as Eric said, in the context of the United States itself changing with regard to free trade globally, was always tricky for us to find.
Eric, did you want to get in there?
I was just going to add, it's a really interesting point that Drew is making, and just to highlight that we've been through this before. So one of Trump's heroes is McKinley, the president from the late 19th century. And McKinley is well known for something called the McKinley Tariff in 1890, which did have the objective of pressuring Canada. And McKinley himself didn't say this, but there were people at the time around McKinley who were trying to pressure pressure Canada into annexation. And so this is a long history, and we have to react to it in the ways that we have in the past.
Where does Canada fit in all of this then?
It's really challenging because there's a few distinct aspects of Canada as a Western middle power. We are trade dependent. We are trade dependent on a country that was always, they can be challenging, our best friend. And they're not. And it's changed suddenly. So we have come, after free trade and the election of 1988, to be comfortable with this environment. And now the environment globally has changed. It's a little bit of a subset of the Prime Minister's speech in Davos. And part of our challenge is we, are trade dependent, like many Western countries. The United States, by the way, isn't. Because its domestic market is so big, they trade within themselves a lot more than any other Western country. We're on the higher side, but of course, that dependence is on one country. And what the Prime Minister now is trying to do is shake this off a little bit and go around the world and do deals, the most controversial being China. And we have tried this before, and right now we are making some progress, but it's not a substitute for the US market that's turning its back on us.
All right, Eric, is this the end of sort of, free markets, minimal government, intervention? Is this the end of neoliberalism?
So at the moment, I would say yes, but it's hard to know where we're going. I mean, the reason I think to argue that that is the situation we're in is that the U.S. Is returning to a policy that was very common for them, before 1945, which was, I mean, people even referred to neo-mercantilism in the 19th century as the American system of political economy. So this is a deep-rooted tradition. Drew made reference to Carney's important speech in Davos. The speech that was made at the same meeting by Jameson Greer, the U.S. Trade representative, invoked this history and said, this is the American history, to be protectionist. And so to the extent that that kind of worldview, that the U.S. is returning to something that for them is historically normal, is a massive shock to the global system, because the U.S. since 1945 has been the leader of promoting a more open world economy. So yeah, in that sense. But I think the more interesting question in terms of looking forward is, does that last?
Yeah.
So will there be a backlash within the United States to some of the Trump protectionism? Because the kinds of protectionism he's done have been much more extreme than were even done in the kind of 19th century era that Trump often invokes. And just to give you one example to finish up here, the McKinley tariff that I mentioned earlier of 1890 produced a reaction in the United States. And so in the 1892 elections, there was a push back towards free trade. And so this isn't set in stone, but it's certainly a massive shock in the way that Drew, I think, is accurately depicting.
All right, Drew.
So that period of 1890 to 1892, coincidentally, is what we might call peak annexation, at least until now. There was significant voter support, not majority by any means, in border areas for annexation. And in the later part of the decade, as the West grew, Canada grew more confident in itself economically, that disappeared. To come up now, many years later, with very little support in Canada, in part because it's being offered by Donald Trump in all the circumstances that we're talking about. It's a really interesting moment. Let me give an example of maybe the limits that Eric was talking about with regard to mercantilism. Let's say that Trump forced Apple to come home. There's a good book in the last year, Apple in China, right? Great book on, their strategy there. How much would an iPhone cost if it was made in the United States? And what's the consumer reaction if that phone doubles or even triples? And what's the reaction of the government in terms of subsidizing American consumers with regard to that? He's not going to bother with subsidizing Canadian consumers, just as one significant product.
In the past, and as you mentioned, mercantilism has led to a more fractured world and conflicts. Where are we headed this time? I'll start with Eric and then we'll finish with,
Yeah, so quickly, neo-mercantilism does not necessarily need to be a conflictual world. So some of the most famous neo-mercantilist thinkers, Frederick List or Henry Carey, others people believed in international cooperation. So the question is Trump doing what he's trying to do as a temporary strategy to then reach some kind of new international agreement? And so some of the people around him talk about a new Bretton Woods, or Jameson Greer has been talking about a new international economic system. Or is Trump in a mode of kind of endless deal making where there's never any final outcome? And if it's the second one, we're in a much more conflictual world. If it's the first one, we're in a kind of a temporary phase where there's an attempt to establish a new equilibrium which needs to be negotiated.
Drew, very quickly.
I fear, exactly right, I fear it's the second. It's hard to think about the president. He's got smart people around him, Jameson Greer being one of them, thinking medium term, thinking long term. But of course, it's this administration with all sorts of problems. And we see that with regard to Canada. You know, we've got 40 million people in Canada who buy as much stuff from the United States as 340 million Americans buy from us. How are we taking advantage of them? I mean, if you can't get along with Canada, you know, you can't really get along with anybody, which is what I fear right now from the administration. But we'll see.
Gentlemen, we are going to have to leave it there. Eric, Drew, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
On top of his trade wars, Donald Trump has also been putting pressure on the Federal Reserve. So where does this leave our central bank? I asked Heather Schofield, who has been analyzing economic policy for 30 years and is now CEO of the Canadian Tax Observatory, about the potential impact this could have here and abroad, and whether we've seen anything like it before. It's a common view that the central banks in the US and in Canada are in lockstep. How true is that?
It's pretty true. It's not 100% true, but it's pretty true. I mean, the Canadian economy is so integrated with the United States that it makes sense that when they move their rates, we also move our rates. And over the course of, I'd say the last 25 years, we've been pretty much in lockstep with them, except for on a couple of occasions. Early in the 2000s, we went our own way because we had an insurance issue that changed our prices. That was a temporary aberration. And then during the Great Financial Crisis, we also didn't follow them exactly because they got themselves in an awful lot more trouble than we did. And so they lowered their rates more than we did, but we still moved in parallel to them. We just kept them a little bit higher. And then more recently, in the last 3 years, we've been, our rates have been different than theirs. And again, that's partly because in the United States, growth is strong. Here, it's not as strong. And so we've gone our own way and kept rates a little bit lower than theirs, but we have moved we're moving in parallel with them just a little bit lower. So there's no doubt the influence of American rates over Canadian rates it's extremely strong, and the ties are extremely strong.
President Donald Trump has been pressuring the current chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, to drop interest rates. Help us understand the controversy behind this.
So central banks have made their name over the course of the last generation by being independent. And that's the way we've been able to keep inflation under control in many rich countries so well. I mean, it's not been perfect, but it's been a fairly good experiment. It's because people in the public and investors know that their central banks will act and use interest rates to control inflation and not to control somebody's political whims. And so when Donald Trump comes along and tries to put pressure on Jerome Powell to cut interest rates, that's potentially quite destructive. We know in the backs of our minds that a lot of politicians want easy money. They want to keep rates lower than they necessarily should be for inflation, because lower rates incite investment. They could bring an immediate bump in terms of jobs and growth, and that feels good for the voting public, and it feels good for a politician who wants some credit. It's just that the longer term effects, or even the medium term effects on inflation, could be quite devastating, and the effects on stability and the investment environment also thrown up into the air. So when Donald Trump is putting pressure on Jerome Powell and then changes the chairman of the Federal Reserve accordingly, there are a lot of questions being asked and a lot of presumptions among the general public and among investors about whether things are going to operate as they've understood them to operate in the past.
Well, let's talk about Jerome Powell's potential replacement, Kevin Warsh. He has been named, but still has to go through Senate. But what has the general reaction been so far?
Well, Mark Carney came out and said it was a fantastic choice. And that was an interesting reaction because I wouldn't have expected Mark Carney to respond so quickly to an announcement of a central banker. I mean, obviously, Our prime minister used to be a central banker himself and has has a lot of insight into Kevin Warsh and who he is. And so, okay, yes, of course, we all want to know what Mark Carney thinks of Kevin Warsh. So that was an interesting reaction, but it's not universal by any means. There are a lot of analysts out there looking at the nominee and saying, okay, he's got a history of a hawk, meaning he has wanted to keep a tight grip on inflation, which is not Donald Trump at all. So
Right.
how does that work? And then there's been a lot of interesting research into his Warsh's statements over the past little while, and it seems that there's some willingness on the part of Warsh to think about lower interest rates under a Republican president. So, we're interpreting everything that he's done in the past through politics rather than what he's done through monetary policy per se. But there's no doubt he has got monetary policy credentials.
If it is the latter, what does that mean?
Well, if he's got Republican tendencies, or if he's got some sympathy for Donald Trump, everybody will be watching for that for sure. He has to persuade everybody else involved in making decisions at the Federal Reserve to go his way, because it's not just up to him, but he will be extremely influential. And over the longer term, if he's doing the president's bidding for him, there's going to be an awful lot of scrutiny to see what happens to inflation and borrowing conditions in the bond market, not just in the United States, but around the world. We're already seeing markets move as a result of his nomination. Currencies around the world will fluctuate based on what he does, including the Canadian dollar. And so that influences our borrowing conditions. It influences our economy going forward.
Heather, in our last 30 seconds, if trade tensions continue and the US and Canadian economies are no longer in that lockstep and aren't as integrated, what can we expect from the Bank of Canada's monetary policy?
So the Bank of Canada plays are pretty straight. They are fixated with inflation. They raise and lower rates according to where they think inflation is going to go. And I don't expect that to change. It's just that what happens to inflation is very tied into what happens with the United States. And yes, we hear an awful lot about, diverging our trade away from the United States. But I think the fact of the matter is we are still very, very integrated with them, not just our trade, but more importantly, our financial markets and our investment flows. And so I expect we will be moving in lockstep, maybe not every single time, but frequently with the United States for some time to come.
In your 30 years of reporting on economic policy, have you seen anything like this before?
I have not. I mean, it's interesting with the Bank of Canada. They came out with their forecast and their assessment of the Canadian economy last week. And their first paragraph was saying everything is kind of the same over the last few months. And their second paragraph is, but it's so unpredictable, we have no idea where we're going. And that is very, very rare for them to say, that they can't see into the future at all, so that, they're basically paralyzed because they can't figure out where things are going next. I mean, I've looked at financial crises around the world over the last few decades and seen a lot of disruption, but I've never seen anything like this in terms of not having a way forward.
Heather, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure.
We want The Rundown to be your show. Let us know what you want to see next. Head to tvo.org/rundownfeedback or leave us a comment on YouTube. Until then, see you tomorrow.